Hello? Can you guys hear me? I can't hear anything.
I can hear you.
Yep.
Hello?
Hi, Buna.
Hi, Buna.
I can hear you.
Hi guys, you can hear me? Perfect.
Hi, Bruno, I
Perfect.
can hear you.
Hi, Buna. We miss you.
Hi,
Yeah,
Bruno.
your beard's grown a little bit.
Oh,
Mine's-
with this coronavirus, they closed down the barbershops. That's it. No more trimming.
Oh wow.
Sorry,
How many
priest jokes.
people have
Priest
got in
jokes. We maxed out at 100, even though we had actually went for the 300 plan, but Zoom, I guess, is not cooperating with us at the moment. So,
Oh, sure.
but we're also streaming on YouTube and streaming on Facebook.
Oh,
So,
Lord have mercy. Lord have
yes.
mercy.
It's so good to see you, and it's really nice to see you. How are you doing with everything that's going on? I mean, we're all in the same boat here.
Yeah, it's a bit insane. So I was actually going to say, when we begin, I'll just explain to everybody that if you hear some screaming voices in the background, please forgive me.
I'm in the same boat.
My kids are home for the first time. Their schools are shut down, and so my wife is attempting to homeschool.
Yes.
Two primary school children and a little toddler. That is, a bit of a disaster. So
no, we're all going through this for sure. I know. But we will start. In Buna, tfaddal. I'm going to introduce you, but please begin with the blessing, please.
in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I'm going to amen.
Okay, welcome.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No. I don't know how this works, so I'll do whatever you tell me to do.
I was just waiting for the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That was good. That was perfect. Welcome, everyone. This is now our second Zoom for our Monday night fellowship meeting. And we are so blessed that everyone is able to make it on. We're so blessed that we have Abuna Daniel Fanous with us tonight. The theme for the month of March, if you're following along and attending the meetings in the past, is the March of Saints. We live among contemporary saints that live among us. Some have passed, some are still alive. And so we took advantage of this month, as we did last year as well, to really speak about and to learn more about these contemporary saints. Some of them, after their passing, there's a lot more stories that come about from them, and we could learn so much from them, those that are living and those that have passed on. We are blessed with us tonight to have with us Father Daniel Fanous. Father Daniel Fanous is a priest from down under, from Australia, from Sydney, Australia. And we had scheduled Abuna way before the pandemic became a pandemic, way before it was even news. And he was so gracious to approve and to be willing to accommodate. And then after the pandemic, I was a little concerned because a lot of things went up in the air, and Abuna again was so gracious to accept to give us the word tonight. Father Daniel is also Dean at St. Cyril Seminary in Sydney, Australia. He is a beloved father and priest as well. His brother is also in the priesthood as well. The two brothers in the priesthood, a great blessing to all of us. And he is now also the author to a newly released book that many of you I know are familiar with and have already purchased and have already read, A Silent Patriarch, which is about the life of His Holiness, the late Saint Pope Kyrillos VI. Abuna, we're so blessed to have you with us, and we can't wait to learn and to grow with you tonight. Thank you, Abuna.
No, thank you. It's really my blessing to be with you all. Again, forgive me that I apparently, as I was trying to log in, I was maxing out the group or something along those lines. So whoever is online and listening, forgive me if you can't get on or someone got dropped off because of me and I took your place. I'm very sorry. So I thought, given this particular crisis that's going on at the moment, to talk about the notion of humility, Pope Kyrillos, and Corona, and how they relate to each other. and how they relate to each other. And so we'll go through and discuss a number of things. You may have, if you've read the book, some of this may be familiar to you, but we'll go through it anyway. So St. Isaac the Syrian says, not every quiet man is humble, but every humble man is quiet. Not every quiet man is humble, but every humble man is quiet. And we'll see how that plays out in the life of Kyrillos. Also, we should keep in mind then C.S. Lewis, who says, true humility is not thinking less of yourself, it is thinking of yourself less. So we'll see how those two kind of quotes play through the life of Kyrillos, and perhaps how they can be useful for us as we then try to navigate our way through this corona pandemic. So right now, especially now, there is a deep need for humility and true humility. It's my deep blessing to speak to you, but us speaking about this is not just entertainment. We are all called to really foster and forge a real deep quality of humility, because it's vital, especially in these days of this unprecedented crisis. I'm not sure what it's like over there in New York, but I imagine it's pretty similar to what it's like here in Sydney. Here, everyone is panicked. The people are fighting over toilet paper. People are fighting over bread, over rice. A friend of mine went to go to the shopping center, and they eventually found some tomato sauce, but they couldn't find any pasta to put the tomato sauce on. And so everybody is panicked. People are fighting. And so now is the time for us to exhibit true humility that can be an oil that soothes the anxiety of those around us. And so with that kind of bit of context, let's begin. There's a very famous story in the Desert Fathers about St. Macarius the Great, where a demon comes to him and says to him, I suffer great violence from you, Macarius, because I cannot overcome you. For you see, I do all the things that you do. You fast, I eat nothing at all. You watch, I never sleep. Abba Macarius then said to him, what is that? What is this thing that you cannot overcome me? Because he says there is one thing which you cannot overcome, which you overcome me. What is that? Macarius asks him. Your humility, the devil replies. For because of it, I cannot overcome you, because of your humility. This was not just a saying. This wasn't just something where somebody decided to write this account down. This was actually something that St. Macarius himself lived out. And so, as many of you may or may not know, in the life of St. Macarius, he begins not in the desert. He begins on the fringes of a village. And on the fringes of that village, he is dwelling. And then one day, an accusation is made against him. A woman has fallen pregnant. She's unmarried. And so the people then ask her, who's then the father? She responds saying, the father is that monk that lives on the outskirts of the village. And so the people then go to this monk that they thought was a holy man, and they go with sticks and they beat him, and they said to him, how dare you rape this girl? How dare you get this girl pregnant? And so he goes silent. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't say anything else. He just goes silent, and he says, truly, now I will work double as hard. I will increase in my labors. If I was making one basket before, I'll now make 2 baskets. If I was creating enough for 1 piece of bread, I'll make now 2 pieces of bread, so that I'll feed this woman and her child. And so the people then leave, and he, bears and endures 9 months of scorn of people, saying to him, who are you? You're disgusting. You're supposed to be a monk. You're supposed to be holy. And look at you, what you're doing, sleeping with this girl. And he bears it silently, until the lady eventually comes to give birth. And when she comes to give birth, she has an obstructed labor. So she's unable to give birth. The labor is just going on and on and on. The baby can't come out. And as you know, back then compared to now, medical care was extremely poor. And so if a woman has an obstructed labor, effectively she dies, baby dies. There's no cesarean sections, there's no kind of suction, there's no vacuums, there's nothing else they can do about it. And so after something like 20 hours of obstructed labor, one of the people says to her, surely something must be wrong. You must have done something. There must be some reason why God's curse has come upon you. And she then responds and says, truly, there is. 9 months ago, I accused that monk, Macarius, but it wasn't him. It was a young farmer boy that, stuck into the barn late at night. And so I falsely accused Macarius. And so the disciple of Macarius, hearing this, sees the people in the village quickly start running towards Macarius to ask him for his prayers and to ask for forgiveness for scorning him. And so the disciples runs and tells Macarius, the people are coming to apologize to you because this girl is in obstructed labor. When he gets to Macarius, he tells him, Macarius says, thank you, does the sign of the cross, and then goes. As soon as he goes, the girl's labor is unobstructed and she gives birth. The people can't even come to St. Macarius in order to say to him, forgive us, we apologize. He's gone. And he disappears then into the deeper desert and beginning the life of Macarius as we know it. And so you see there's in the life of Macarius, in St. Macarius, that humility is so deep that he bears insult without a question. He doesn't defend himself. And then beyond that, when they come to apologize to him, again, he won't even accept their apology. He disappears. He doesn't need it. And so because of this, the devil says to Macarius, your humility, because of it, I cannot overcome you. And so I thought to use this story as kind of a bit of an entrance to the life of Pope Kyrillos, in the life of, so we can understand the idea of humility, because it's something that speaks on a number of levels to what we'll talk about now. So, well, first of all, what value is there in a life? What value is life? What's the point of talking about the life of Pope Kyrillos? Is it so that we can go through some kind of fascinating, historical figure and look at his life and see what that means? I actually think that there is nothing value in a human life. There's nothing fascinating about a human life. It's just history. Like the scriptures, it's not about what the text meant, but what about the text means for us today. To look at scripture, as Origen says, and look at it and sees, there's a movement, there's an exodus, they go from village X, from town Y to Z. What does that mean? That means nothing. That's just a historical account. The value is in when you unveil the scripture and see what's underneath. Christ. So that means that the value is not what is written in the text only, but when we unveil that text, what it means for us. So as St. Paul says, what happened in a figure but was always for us. So that means that the life of Pope Kyrillos is only valuable to us if it is something for us today. Reading as a historical account, great. It's like reading any historical novel. It's like reading Napoleon, reading Julius Caesar, whatever you want to do. It has no value unless it is of action, of meaning for us today, like scripture. So let's talk a little bit then about humility and what the actual word, the etymology of the word is. So it comes from the Latin word humilitas, which means a lowness, a meanness, a baseness, from humilis, which means lowly, humble, or earth. So somebody that is close to the earth. The Greek word for humility, again, is related to that a little bit with this idea of being lower, humble, or having a moderation inside myself. There's another word in English which sounds very similar, humiliation. And that comes from the Latin word humiliationem, which means a humbling, a humiliation, which is the act of humiliating or humbling or abasement or mortification. Those two words are actually much closer than you think. They don't just sound similar in the English language or in Latin. They are organically linked. The two of them are organically linked. So let's then talk about what humility is and what humility is not. Because it's no good calling us all to be humble as a way of kind of soothing the world at the moment in this crisis. We have to actually understand what humility is and what humility is not. I remember when I was going in Sunday school in pre-servants, which I don't know if you guys have pre-servants in New York, but the kind of program afterwards to prepare you to be a servant. I wasn't the best of kids that was in the pre-servants class. I was always quite cheeky and wouldn't listen to anything. And one of the servants didn't like me very much. And I always felt that the reason he didn't like me very much is because I didn't go around beating my chest. And so if there were kids in the class that were always like eyes down and beating their chest, he loved them. But any kids that are a little bit loud, he kind of thought we were just useless to the service. And he was probably right. Until I read this story. And when I read this story, I said, you know what? Maybe I'm actually humble. Maybe I'm actually humble. I'm obviously not humble by saying that, but you get the point. So a brother went to find Abba Serapion. And according to his custom, this is from the Desert Fathers, the old man invited him to say a prayer, but the other, calling himself a sinner and unworthy of the monastic habit, did not obey. Next, Abba Serapion wanted to wash his feet, But using the same words again, the visitor prevented him, saying, I cannot accept this. Then Abba Serapion made him eat, and he began to eat with him. Then he admonished him, saying, My son, if you want to make progress, stay in your cell and pay attention to yourself and your manual work. Going out is not so profitable for you as at remaining at home. When he heard these words, the visitor was offended, and his expressions changed so much that the old man could not but notice. So he said to him, Up to now you have called yourself a sinner and accused yourself of being unworthy to live. But when I admonished you lovingly, you were extremely put out. If you want to be humble, learn to bear generously what others unfairly inflict upon you, and do not harbor empty words in your heart. Hearing this, the brother asked the old man's forgiveness and went away greatly edified. Humility is often misunderstood. We often think about humility as exactly what that visitor was doing. Come say a prayer. No, I can't. Come and eat with me. No, I can't. I don't eat. Let me wash your feet. No, unworthy. You could never wash my feet. So then it's a voluntary act of me putting myself down. And that's what this visitor does. So then Serapion then starts to put this person down and say, what you're doing is unwise. Why do you even come here in the beginning? Go back to your cell. As soon as he said that, the visitor became shocked. His face visibly changed. Because he couldn't handle somebody else putting him down. He could put himself down, but he couldn't accept for somebody else to put him down. And this is then the difference between humility and false humility and true humility. Putting myself down achieves nothing. If I'm in a line and I say, no, I'm not worthy, I'm going to go to the second in the line and you can go first, is very different to me standing at the front of the line, and I should be at the front of the line. I have every right to be at the front of the line. I've worked to be at the front of the line. And then somebody comes and says to me, you there, you're unworthy, get to the back of the line. That will then test my humility. I will then see at that point how humble truly I am. Am I humble, or am I just acting like I'm humble? And so then there is a beating of the chest versus true humility. So what then is humility? To get a sense of what real humility is, we have to look at Pope Kyrillos' adopted spiritual father, St. Isaac the Syrian. If you've read the book, you'll notice that I talk quite a lot about St. Isaac the Syrian, with good reason. St. Isaac the Syrian was a very unusual spiritual father, because he lived centuries and centuries and centuries before Pope Kyrillos. There's often a saying that if you know a man, you know his father. Or you may prefer, an apple never falls far from the tree. Because what you see in a son is often reflected in the father, and what you see in a father is often reflected in the son. Father Mina's first spiritual father, Abuna Abdul Masih al-Masudi, who was a prolific scholar, gave him a manuscript. It was St. Isaac the Syrian's The Ascetical Homilies. And so Pope Kyrillos took these ascetical homilies and transcribed them 5 times immediately. He immersed himself in the thought world of St. Isaac the Syrian. And from then on, even as Pope Kyrillos, after he became patriarch, he would always cite St. Isaac the Syrian. Almost all of his letters, if he's going to quote a church father, it's St. Isaac the Syrian. Even his maxims that he speaks, that people think is Pope Kyrillos, is actually often him just repeating the words of St. Isaac the Syrian. And of course, many people have noticed this, but it's almost always been noticed superficially. We never quite notice how much St. Isaac the Syrian transformed Pope Kyrillos, how much St. Isaac the Syrian was actually the spiritual father of Pope Kyrillos. And so if you really want to understand who Pope Kyrillos is and his meaning for us today, then you actually have to probably immerse yourself in the writings of St. Isaac the Syrian. At the beginning of when he was then Father Mina, Pope Kyrillos wrote in an autobiographical fragment about his years after he was tonsured as a monk. And he says, I began to learn the rules of monasticism from the fathers and started studying the books of the saints, especially those written by the great St. Isaac the Syrian. And I began to feel the grace of God growing within me day by day. Or elsewhere he wrote, I had always longed for the path of solitude, the path that so many fathers have pondered, especially St. Isaac the Syrian, who commands all monks, saying that every monk who has left the world and join monasticism should not stay too long with the assembly. And so, from the beginning, Pope Kyrillos took to himself St. Isaac the Syrian as his spiritual father. And the only way that you can probably describe it is that of a patristic discipleship. A patristic discipleship. And it's not unheard of in the Orthodox tradition. Often you'll find the idea of if a spiritual father is lacking, then you can look to the Holy Fathers. And so that's exactly what he did. That's exactly what he did. Even at one point, when he was ordained as patriarch, they asked Pope Kyrillos, what was your favorite book? And he responded saying, the book of Abba Isaac the Syrian, which discusses the life of solitude and silence. And so even from the beginning, he's making it very clear that he is living these words. Today, one of the things that we do, and I'm the greatest of sinners in this aspect, is that we read everything. We read so much, God knows how much I read. And so when you read so much, words to a certain extent also sometimes become a little bit worthless. Pages become worthless. Ideas become worthless because there's so many of them. I read them so quickly that I haven't got a chance to live them. This was very, very different. Every word was transcribed, copied, memorized, breathed, lived, incarnated by Pope Kyrillos. Every single word. It started to form part of his being. Even in 1966, there was a German scholar, Otto Maynardus, who flew into Wadarian to meet the monks of Abuna Matel Meskin, even though he's a saint, Abuna Matel Meskin at that time. And when he went to meet him, he found something very interesting. Abuna Matta said to him that he had acquired a copy of the ascetical homilies of St. Isaac the Syrian from Father Mina. Okay, and that copy was actually in Father Mina's handwriting. And so it was then one of those copies that Father Mina had transcribed. He gave that copy to Abuna Matta. And actually, if you read in the Orthodox prayer life, you will notice that when the reference homilies, in sometimes according to
Abuna.
Yes, sorry.
There was static. Can you just go back maybe 30?
Sure, no problem. And so the copy of Isaac the Syrian that was used, that even that Abuna Matta references to in his Orthodox prayer life, he says is from the hand of Father Mina. From the hand of Father Mina. To that German scholar, when he arrived in 1966, Abuna Matta said, the writings of Isaac served as a spiritual guide to Abuna Matta. Subsequently, all of his disciples copied his writings. So not only was Abuna Matta using the writings of St. Isaac the Syrian, a gift of a book, literal handwritten book, given to him by Abuna Mina, by Pope Kyrillos, but he also then got his own disciples to start copying out the words of St. Isaac the Syrian. Okay, and they would obviously those monks would form the nucleus of St. Macarius Monastery. The same with many of the other Syrian monks from Deir Syrian. And so if you then look, fascinating, this is just a side point, Pope Kyrillos, Abuna Matel Meskin, Pope Shenouda, the major figures of Coptic monasticism and reforms, all of them saints in their own respects, were all hermits, solitaries, all of them obsessed and formed by St. Isaac the Syrian. Something very interesting for us to understand. So that's kind of all just kind of a backdrop before I get you into the hot and heavy, material of St. Isaac the Syrian on humility. And so there'll be a little bit of reading here, forgive me, but I'll try to read them clearly so that you can understand them, even despite my Australian accent. Australians apparently not as articulate as Americans, so you'll have to forgive me. So St. Isaac the Syrian says this: being quiet or gentle by nature is not true humility. There is a difference between natural and supernatural humility. There is a difference between natural and supernatural humility. In the words of St. Isaac the Syrian, he says this: do not adduce for me as an example those who are humble by nature. Don't bring for me people that are humble by nature. These people do not possess this discerning lowliness, which consists in lowly thoughts, discerning and painstaking reflection. The insignificance in which a person regards himself, his heart broken, and the flow of tears stemming from the suffering of mind and discernment of the will. If you choose, ask them, you will find that they have none of these. They do not meditate and recollect the lowliness of our Lord. They are not pierced by the sharp pain that comes from the knowledge of their sins. He goes on and says, it is exactly the same with those who are mild and humble by nature. It is nature which has moderated their impulses, and not the strength of will. These people neither taste, nor are they in the slightest aware of the sweetness of the charisms and consolations of which those who are humble for the Lord's sake. A quiet man is not always humble. What St. Isaac the Syrian is saying here is that there are people that are humble by nature, look humble by nature. They're a bit more quiet, they're a little bit more introverted, they're a bit more timid, they don't react as forcefully, their faces are a bit more gentle, a little bit more serene, their words are a little bit calmer, their voices are a little bit softer. He's saying these are not humble people. These are people that seem to be humble because nature has moderated their impulses. That is a natural humility, not a supernatural humility. And if it's a natural humility, it means nothing. It may make you a bit more of a likable person, but in terms of spiritual growth, in terms of spiritual impact, it actually means nothing. True humility, a supernatural humility, he says, is one from a man or a woman whose mind and heart are constantly broken, reflecting on the life of Christ and the lowliness of the Lord, and are sharing in his lowliness. At another point, he says, humility is the raiment of the Godhead. Humility is the clothes of God. Is the clothes of God. It is something that we are called to put on, making a man, in the words of St. Isaac the Syrian, a God on earth. Making a man a God on earth. And so that means true humility is not walking around beating my chest with my eyes lowly with a soft voice. I'm unworthy. I have no right to speak. That's not humility. True humility is somebody that puts on the humility of God, that shares, participates, organically in the humility of God. And then he says, there are both inward and outward signs of humility. The first is that we must have a deep sense of God's presence, a humiliating presence. He says, a man must perceive himself before his maker. And so that inward sense of humility is, I know who I am in the face of God. The words, for example, the same experience of Isaiah. In Isaiah 6, when he comes before the throne of God, and as he comes before the throne of God, he's unable to speak. And then cherubim goes and takes a coal from the altar and touches it to his tongue and opens his mouth. And the words that come out are these: woe is me, I am undone. Because who am I in front of the presence of God? How can I speak in front of the presence of God? I'm exposed. I'm exposed. And so then the first inward sign, the deep sign, is a deep sense of the presence of God. A presence that humiliates me, that lowers me in the sense of that word humiliate, that brings me to the ground. And so true humility then is a union with Christ's own humility. We put on the raiment of God. And that entails, above all, like Christ, stillness in the face of temptation and tribulation. And that's how we get into Corona. Stillness in the face of temptation and tribulation. So Isaac the Syrian says this, and pay attention to these words very carefully. A humble man is never rushed, hasty, or agitated, never has any hot or volatile thoughts, but at all times remains calm. Even if heaven were to fall and cleave to the earth, the humble man would not be dismayed. Not every quiet man is humble, but every humble man is quiet. For the humble man is always at rest, because there is nothing which can agitate or shake his mind. Just as no one can frighten a mountain, so the mind of the humble man cannot be frightened. This is really, really interesting, because he defines humility not as in somebody that can be quiet, not as somebody that can keep their head down, not that somebody that is not arrogant, not that somebody doesn't have pride, not that somebody doesn't think he's greater than everybody else, which is how we define humility. We define and measure humility by how much pride somebody has, by how somebody acts, about whether someone puts themselves above other people. But St. Isaac's, the Syrian definition of humility, is somebody that shares in Christ's own humility, who was still in the face of temptation and tribulation. And that means that the measure of my humility is the degree to which I am agitated when things shake around. My stillness in my heart is the measure of my humility. And that's something that I think we should all pay attention to, because that's not how we measure humility. We measure humility in outward signs. We measure humility by how arrogant somebody sees or acts. We don't measure humility as virtue, sharing in Christ's own virtue, and more than that, in my stillness in the face of tribulation. And so for all of us that are listening, and I speak to myself first, really I speak to myself first, look at your heart. How agitated are we? How easily have we slipped back into old sins? How easily have we went and escaped from this pain and run to different types of pleasures in this time of coronavirus? How easily have we become panicked? How easily have we went and hoarded toilet paper? How easily have we ran to do these things? Have we been still? Have we been a source of peace to those around us, our families, our colleagues? Or have we been panicked like everyone else? Because if heaven were to fall and cleave to the earth, the humble man or woman would not be dismayed. That is the measure, and that is the marker of humility. Simple. Simple. It reminds me of an unrelated story, and I won't mention the name of the monk because it's an interesting story. But you can all figure it out at some point. He's passed away now anyway. He was a bit of a crazy fool, a holy fool. He used to act a bit nuts. Whether he had a little bit of personality in him that was a little bit crazy as well, it's hard to say sometimes with these holy fools. But he was certainly a bit of a joker, but an extremely holy man, a saint. And at one point, this was back, I think, in the 1950s or 60s or something like that. One of the bishops had just received a brand new Mercedes. No one had cars at the time. And so this bishop had received this brand new Mercedes. Someone had bought it for him, or he had bought it for himself. I have no idea. And so he went and drove into the monastery, St. Macarius monastery, and was very proud of this beautiful Mercedes, was showing it off to the monks. And so this monk went and then looked and goes, Sedna, it's a beautiful car. It's really like a beautiful car. He said, what's this? And this was before the days that the Mercedes symbol was screwed in. So it was actually attached to the hood of the car. And so he goes, what's this? And he grabbed it and goes, and broke it off. And then he took it. He goes, oh, I'm so sorry, Sedna. I'm so sorry. And then Sedna said to him, what are you doing, you crazy monk? That's a brand new car. It's a brand new Mercedes. That's it. Go get all of your belongings and go sit in the car. I'm going to take you away from the monastery. And so the monk said, I don't really have anything. So he just sat in the car. Didn't take any belongings with him. And so he took that monastery to the monastery of Bush, which is one of the dependencies of the monastery, and dropped him off there. He left him in that dependency for 1 year. That monk didn't complain, didn't open his mouth, didn't speak about it, just continued living his monastic life, doesn't matter where he is. After a year, the bishop remembered that he had left that monk in that monastery, away from his monastery for a year. So he went to him and said to him, forgive me, Father, I got a bit ahead of myself, forgive me. He goes, go get your belongings and come back to your monastery. He goes, okay. And just walked into the car and sat down. He didn't have any belongings. He was unfazed. Nothing touched him. He was still. It didn't matter what happened, he was still. And so that is then the marker of humility. St. Isaac the Syrian then goes on and says, the man who endures accusations against himself with humility has arrived at perfection. This teaches, Isaac says, will be a sign for you. The strength of the temptations you encounter, the nearer you draw near and progress, the more temptations will multiply against you. know that at the time your soul has in fact secretly entered a new and higher level. For God leads the soul into the afflictions of trials in exact proportion to the magnificence of the grace he bestows. So saying this is then the sign of humility, that as somebody becomes more and more humble, as they approach more and more perfection, that the strength of temptations will increase and will multiply against them. But just as the strength of the temptation increases, so does the grace of God. And this probably then explains why in the life of Pope Kyrillos, that tribulation increased as his miracles became more and more manifest, which is something that we often don't realize, the degree to which he was persecuted, not by the government, not by the Muslim Brotherhood, but by his own clergy. And that's something that we'll talk about a little bit as well. So humility for the sake of God, Isaac concludes, makes you like a child, makes you like a child. And the defenselessness of small children forces God to take particular care of them, to take particular care of them. So the image then he has that Isaac the Syrian is giving us is, imagine you have a baby, and that baby is you know, as they used to do in the old days, throw the baby at the foot of the mountain because you didn't want the baby. Imagine any of us walking past anywhere, the street, and you see a little baby in some clothes dropped on the ground somewhere. What's our natural reaction? Because the baby is defenseless, we quickly grab that baby, embrace that baby, put that baby into our own clothes, hold it and defend that baby as if it was our own person, even more than our own person. Likewise, Isaac the Syrian says, when we are truly humble, lowly, not trying to defend ourselves, then we become defenseless like a baby. And that forces God to take particular care of us. And that is why, in the face of humiliation, it is God alone who defends the humble. And the beginning of humility is therefore humiliation. The beginning of humility is humiliation. Isaac the Syrian says, someone who is able to suffer wrong with joy, though having at hand that means to rebuff it. Notice that. It is somebody who is able to suffer wrong with joy, even though you have at hand the means to rebuff it. So what he's saying is someone that is willing to suffer a wrong, even though they have the capacity to make that wrong go away. Okay? They have the means, whether the intellectual capacity, the personality, whatever it may be, has consciously received from God the consolation of his faith. The man who endures accusations, or woman, who endures accusations against himself with humility, has arrived at perfection, and he is marveled at by the holy angels, for there is no other virtue so great and so hard to achieve. These are the words of St. Isaac the Syrian. These are the words of St. Isaac the Syrian. And I think we should pay attention to them. We should really pay attention to them. St. John Climacus, at one point in his Ladder of Divine Ascent, says that just as Satan fell from heaven because of one vice, pride, man can raise from earth to heaven by one virtue, humility. Because when we are humble, we put on the humility of God. We become defenseless, so he defends us. What's really interesting, just to kind of shift direction a little bit, is that sociology actually agrees incredibly with this. And I'm talking about sociologists who aren't even Christians. If you go through sociology journals, you'll find that humility is its own kind of genre, its own kind of motif or topic of literature. So in one of the sociology journals says this: humility is most accurately judged in situations that evoke egotism under strain, i.e. humility is born in conflict, in the wake of praise or recognition, whilst interacting in a hierarchical relationship, and we know how hard that is sometimes, during the interplay between different groups with different divergent norms, or most intensely when ideas are linked to identity. So these aren't my words, these are words from a journal. That humility is most accurately judged in situations that evoke the ego under strain, i.e. in conflict, when people try to praise you or recognize you, when you're interacting with, you know, a hierarchical relationship, whether that's a bishop, whether that's a boss at work, whether that's your wife, again, she's always above you, during the interplay between different groups with different norms, or more intensely when ideas are linked to identity. In such settings, these journals say, humility corresponds with one, higher levels of forgiveness. Again, these are not Christian journals. This is just sociology. Humility corresponds with higher levels of forgiveness. It forces one to appreciate the we rather than the I. And so then it becomes something they call a social bond hypothesis, where people are then more willing to sacrifice themselves without negative feelings of resentment or loss. And 3, humility may buffer competitive traits that create relational conflict, i.e., humility may buffer that we always try to want a friction. We always want to have friction between relationships and be competitive with each other. Something they call the social oil hypothesis. And so if you look at that, those 3 things, high levels of forgiveness, making me focus more on the we than the I, and buffers competitive traits that create relational friction, think about the value of humility now in this crisis. Forgiveness, look at the we rather than the I, creates an oil for that relational friction. So humility is born in settings of tension, and in reverse, it acts to relieve that tension. Not only is humility created, if you like, an oil that is created by friction, by tension, by conflict, by hyper competition, but when it is created in that environment, it actually is created to soothe that environment. So what can we conclude then? There is a difference between natural and true humility. True humility is the union with Christ's own humility, which is a Christification or deification or theosis, whatever you want to call it. Humility is created by a deep presence of God, the humiliation of being in the presence of God. Or as St. Isaac the Syrian says somewhere else, that if you want to stand down, get on your knees to pray and stand before the presence of God, then you better be willing to, to handle the stench that comes out because I'm exposed. Humility is marked by an inner stillness in the face of tribulation. It makes you like a child so that God pours out his protection on you, and therefore humiliation is the beginning of humility. And 5th, humility is not only forged in crisis, it creates an oil to soothe the relational friction. And so in the life of Pope Kyrillos, in the face of humiliation, his humility was forged. In the face of humiliation, his humility was created, granting him the personal capacity to withstand such trials and creating the oil that would soothe the grating wounds of the church at that time. And so this idea of humility being forged in crisis, but also creating an oil to heal that relational friction, is extremely true for us today. Not only in the life of Pope Kyrillos, but in our own lives, especially today. Literally, we are finding people fighting over toilet paper. One of the most embarrassing things is in Sydney, there was the first physical fight over toilet paper. The first physical fight that the police had to charge people on went viral. And you know what is the saddest thing about all of that? It was 2 women, 2 Egyptian Coptic women. The first fight over toilet paper in Australia, 2 Egyptian Coptic women. And it went viral. It was deeply embarrassing. Deeply embarrassing. Us who are called to put on the humility of God. Us who bear the indwelling of Christ in us. Us who are called to be Christified. And we're the ones that are fighting over toilet paper. The first ones to fight over toilet paper. And I make no judgment over those 2 people. That's their business. I've got no issue there. But what I'm trying to say is sometimes we forget why we are in church. We forget why we are baptized. We forget why we commune in the Eucharist. We forget why he is in us. It's so that we can bear his humility. We can share in his humility. We can become an oil then for the world, not a fire. And we have to keep that in mind. And again, allow me to share with you a phone call I received the other day. I got a phone call from a very serious person who said to me, Father, I'd just like to invite you and your family to come and stay at my farm should things go south. Should there be an apocalypse and things go a little bit crazy, my farm can take 110 people. I want to invite you and your family to come. I've got 3 containers of stockpiled food and supplies, and we have everything, and no one will come near us. And then I said, okay, that's very kind of you. Thank you. I don't think that's necessary, but thank you very much. I was trying to be very respectful and humble. And then he said to me, Father, can I ask you a question? I said, of course. He said, do you have a gun? I said, no, I don't have a gun. And he goes, okay, you might need to get a gun. Everyone that's coming to the farm needs to have a gun. And he was dead serious. And this is a very rational person. At least I thought so until this point. And I said to him, what do you mean I need a gun? He said, because every family that comes needs to have 1 gun between them, because we're going to take shifts of circling the farm at night, so that when people come and try to steal our food, we can fight them off with our guns. And I thought to myself, thank you very much. God bless you. And I hanged up. And I thought, what level of insanity? What level of insanity? We are not called to defend our own. We are not called to create barriers and boundaries around our own to protect ourselves. We are called to be the oil that soothes the wounds of those around us. That is our calling. And that means what we need right now is deep humility that is forged in crisis, a stillness that is forged in the midst of this tribulation, not only for ourselves, but so that we can create oil that soothes the wounds of those around us, heal that relational friction that is happening around us. And so I know that sometimes at these points we are thinking about our families, right? I need to protect my family. I need to protect my kids. I need to make sure that no virus comes upon them. I need to make sure this and whatever happens. I need to have enough toilet paper. I need to have enough rice, enough bread, and whatever else. But we also have to think this circumstance is for us to create oil so that we can protect the world, so that we can heal the world. So let us then return to the. Sorry, I don't know how much time we have. Do I keep going? I don't know how much we've taken. You tell me. I have no idea. Keep going. All right. So let's then return to this patristic discipleship in the life of Pope Kyrillos. That patristic discipleship in humility explains and makes sense of certain mysteries in the life of Pope Kyrillos. Pope Kyrillos, as many of you know, was a silent patriarch, hence the title of the book. He never gave a homily, at least not a recorded homily. He only wrote 1 or 2 paschal addresses. So even his festal addresses that he wrote, the Easter nativity messages, actually he only wrote probably the first between 1959 to 1960, 1961. After that, other people wrote them for him. Even in official engagements, he was a man of exceedingly few words. Exceedingly few words. When you look at Kyrillos' life and his writings, it becomes really interesting that he had an affinity, a love for one particular homily of St. Isaac the Syrian above all the rest. Even though he quoted from the others, there was one he quoted again and again in different contexts, different passages from it, all over the place. That was homily 64. Homily 64 in the ascetical homilies. And unsurprisingly, one of the principal concerns in that homily is silence. It's impossible, writes St. Isaac the Syrian, that when we dwell in a place inhabited by many, that we should not be met by other men. So he's saying it is impossible that when we dwell in a place of many, whether it's a monastery, whether it's a city, whatever it is, that we should not be met by other men. We can't live solitude. We can't live solitude in front of other people because we'll always meet other people. And so then St. Isaac the Syrian gives the example of St. Isaac of Abba Arsenios, St. Arsenios the Great. And he says this, when therefore, this is all in homily 64, when therefore that man Arsenios beheld all these things and saw that it would not be possible to avoid them as long as he was near the habitation of them. So he couldn't avoid other people. And when he found that it was often impossible because of the place of his abode, his home, to be far withdrawn from the proximity of men and from the monks who settled in those parts. So no matter where he went, he was surrounded by other monks. Then from grace, he learned this way of life, unbroken silence. And if out of necessity he ever opened his door to some of them, They were gladdened only by the mere sight of him. And so St. Arsenius the Great, according to St. Isaac the Syrian, when he found no other way of living solitude, because no matter what he did, he was surrounded by people, he chose this way of life, unbroken silence. For Pope Kyrillos, far more than St. Arsenius the Great in the 5th century in the middle of the desert, solitude was an impossibility given his office. As Patriarch, it's impossible to live solitude. He has to make decisions. He has to attend meetings. He has to meet with the president. He has to meet with whoever else. So given that Pope Kyrillos quoted the 64th homily of St. Isaac the Syrian more frequently, more consistently than any other, these words have to form the lens by which we interpret his unusual silence. They have to. It wasn't because of inaptitude. It wasn't because of deficiency. It wasn't because of a lack of confidence. It wasn't even simply because he preferred to delegate to those who were better than him. Silence was Kyrillos' means of maintaining solitude in the world. It was his means of maintaining solitude in the world. It was his means of inhabiting an internalized desert. But there's also another rationale for silence. Excuse me. I haven't got coronavirus. I've just got something in my throat. I actually don't. I was tested. So I got my results back today. So I'm fine. So don't ask. There's another rationale that is found at the end of the homily, where St. Isaac the Syrian says that, and for St. Isaac the Syrian, stillness is related to silence. He says this: even if you are wronged or cheated or mocked and so forth, you will not be moved because of your love of stillness, silence. Whoever enters into stillness without this continual rumination will not be able to bear those things that we are obliged to undergo and to endure from all sides. So I think the Syrian is saying, unless you are silent, unless there is silence in your internalized desert, you cannot bear the tribulations that come upon you. You cannot bear them. Pope Kyrillos, as I said, was acutely mocked and persecuted from the very beginning of his monastic life until his death. But no matter the accusation, the attack, or the abuse, those closest to him insist he never lost his inner peace. Why? Because silence forged within him an inner stillness, the gift of humility in the face of a relentless tribulation. And that's something really important for us to understand. You know, one of the things that I tried to make clear in the book is that we often think or don't think about Pope Kyrillos and his persecution. We think that he was a saint, and so he must have been received as a saint in his own time. But that actually is not the case at all. It's not the case at all. When I was visiting, I won't say the abbot of which monastery, but one of the bishops of the largest monasteries in Egypt, I said to him, tell me about your first experience with Pope Kyrillos. He goes, I can't. There wasn't a first experience. He goes, when I entered into the monastery in 1959, the same year that Pope Kyrillos was made patriarch, he goes, for the first 3 or 4 years, he goes, every time the name of the patriarch came up, all of the older monks in the monastery cursed him. And they would tell me, never meet him, never greet him, never kiss his hand. He's a sorcerer. Because these were the most respected monks at the time. He was a sorcerer. And this was the feeling of many of the people at the time. The clergy were the ones that gave him grief. And so for Pope Kyrillos, this became something that had to be incarnated in a very real level. As I said, words to us become worthless, but to him they weren't worthless. He lived them. He lived them. And so around Pope Kyrillos' cell was scattered through actually many of his letters, is found one maxim, one saying of St. Isaac the Syrian in particular, to the extent that people often think it's Pope Kyrillos' words, but it's not. Honor flees away from before the man that runs after it, but he who flees from honor, the same will it hunt down, and he will become to all men, it will become to all men a herald of his humility. There is no theme as prevalent as humility in the Harbour of Salvation, the early journals that he wrote, as humility. In one letter that he wrote to Abuna Macarius Rieni, the future Amber Samuel, he says, truly, my son, I am very sad because I cannot achieve humility up until now. Up until now. At one point, I asked Father Raphael of Amina, who was Pope Kyrillos' deacon for some 5 years, and I said to him, "Tell me something that that people don't really talk about with Pope Kyrillos." He said to me, "You know why he was a saint? One reason. He surrounded himself with those who did not flatter him, but those who opposed him." So not only was he surrounded by bishops that kind of had a very sour relationship with him, at least at the beginning, not only did he have newspapers writing against him and priests against him and monks against him, but he himself surrounded himself by people that opposed him. As a young monk, for example, his brother Hannah, Pope Kyrillos' brother Hannah, would always rebuke him. So if you read some of the letters, and God willing, this will be a project in the future, that at one time when Pope Kyrillos, when he was young Father Mina, tried to enter into solitude, to leave the monastery and go into a cave in the middle of the desert, to have deeper solitude, his brother rebuked him and said, "Why are you so arrogant? Who do you think you are? Are you doing this just because you want people to look at you so they can make you a bishop, so they can make you famous? What are you doing this for?" And so he wrote about his brother, and Abuna Raphael of Amina said this. He goes, "I was serving the patriarch for 5 years. There was not a single time that Hannah, his brother, told him, 'You are good, you are a saint.' Instead, each time his brother came to him, he would ask him, 'Why did you do this? Why would you do that? That makes no sense.' And precisely because of this, Kyrillos respected him greatly. If Hannah had flattered him, he would have had nothing to do with him. And so whether it was his confessor, his brother Hannah, the numerous outspoken bishops that he ordained, including our beloved Pope Shenouda, Amber Samuel, and Gregorius, as well as Abuna Matta, who he put in the charge of St. Macarius Monastery, Pope Kyrillos surrounded himself with truth. And so Abuna Raphael of Amina says, why did he love these people? Because they opposed him. They kept him humble. They kept him humble. I'm observing some questions on the chat. I'll probably answer those after. And so humiliation really was the beginning of humility for Pope Kyrillos. But it came in two main places. From his own clergy and from the lay community council. So I won't talk about the lay community council, but I'll make some comments, some very big comments, just to give you a sense. On one occasion, Pope Kyrillos gave his disciple a stack of incoming letters. And the disciple, seeing that Pope Kyrillos was very exhausted, started to read them. And then changed his mind and said, now please give me permission that I can destroy these letters. But Pope Kyrillos insisted, this disciple says, that I should read them to him. And after I did, he smiled and said, don't worry about this, my son, nor become disturbed. May the Lord look at me and have pity on me. Worse than that has been said, but thanks to the Lord, he has saved and watched over me. These words were filled with so much scorn and accusations and mockery. And yet Pope Kyrillos loved them. After he died, when they examined his private drawers, they found in his drawers nothing, pretty much nothing. Some little trinkets and things like that. But the only letters they found in there were the ones that Pope Kyrillos thought worth keeping. The ones that accused him, the ones that scorned him, the ones that mocked him, the ones that criticized him unfairly, because he felt that these were worth keeping. These were worth keeping. I asked the disciple of Pope Kyrillos, Father Raphael of Amina, about these letters, whether he still had these letters. And he said to me, he goes, I kept them. I kept them until the year 2000, when I couldn't bear to have them in my cell anymore, and I burnt them. Because I couldn't even bear to have them in my cell anymore. Which is a bit of a shame. It would have been interesting to see what Pope Kyrillos, the benefit he took from them. But, so is the will of God. And then the problem of prayer was a huge one. As I said, most people don't realize how much he was scorned. And often it was to do with two issues, the prayer and the miracles. One of the reasons why I said that people thought he was a sorcerer was because of miracles. They couldn't understand them. We are so used to thinking of people in the 1950s and 1960s as if they were, especially in Egypt, as if they were superstitious, they were pretty much semi-pagans, and they just believed anything, and that's why they accepted all these miracles. It's actually not the case at all. If you look pre-1959, so pre the reign of Pope Kyrillos, and look at all the patriarchs before him in the previous 60, 70 years, none of them were miracle performers. It is scarce even to find a saint in that previous 60 years that perform miracles. You know, if you look after him, people that are beloved in the Coptic imagination, people like Pope Shenouda, Habib Getkus, these people weren't miracle performers. And so Pope Kyrillos was an anomaly. They didn't understand these miracles. They hadn't seen these miracles. They couldn't make sense of them. And so they felt he was a sorcerer. One of the people that told me this actually was my own confession father, who was one of the students at the Theological College at the time. And he said, he goes, we didn't go anywhere near Pope Kyrillos. He goes, our Sunday school teachers told us don't go near him. He does black magic. He's a sorcerer. And if you read in the accusations from the newspapers at the time, they were the same thing. People couldn't understand him. He was an anomaly. But strangely, even more than the miracles, the things that most afflicted the people was prayer, the problem of prayer. They couldn't understand him. Abuna Loa Sidoros, who I think is actually serving in California, wrote, the greatest thing that caused difficulty for Kyrillos at the beginning of his patriarchate, that provoked criticism from elders, bishops, priests, and foreigners, was that they said, we wanted a patriarch, not a chanter. What is this? All day and night in psalmody, prayers, matins, vespers, liturgy, and you just leave the church the way it is. The church needs reform, healing. It needs one to go on its behalf to the government and the president, one who can understand these issues and bring results for the Copts. So arise the tide of criticism against him because of this one thing, prayer. And so throughout, and I give many of these accounts in the book, people were accusing him. Who is this patriarch that does nothing but stay silent and pray? It made no sense. And so I think I've went a little bit long, so I won't kind of go through the material on the community council, and I'll kind of skip to the take-home messages before I take some questions. But the take-home messages are these. The difference between natural and true humility. True humility is union with Christ's own humility. It's not going around beating your chest. You can be the most loud, extroverted person and be the humblest person on the earth. It's marked by an inner stillness in the face of tribulation. It makes you like a child who pours out God's protection, who God pours out protection on, through silence, through humiliation as the beginning of humility. And so then the marker of my humility is not how loud I am, is not how boisterous I am, but is very simple, how still I am in the face of tribulation. And if I am then still in the face of tribulation, humility creates an oil to soothe relational friction. And again, this is not a historical talk. This is the solution to our problems today. And so one of the last things I'd like to say to you all, and I say it to myself first, please forgive me, is that we are called to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Think about those words. Salt of the earth. Not the salt of one piece of T-bone steak and its length, forgive me. But we often think about ourselves like that. If we are called to be the salt of the earth, and we keep pouring the salt on one piece of meat in our church, in our parishes, in our Coptic diocese, and we just keep putting more salt, more salt, more salt, more salt, what happens to the piece of steak? It becomes oversalted. It becomes inedible. In actual fact, loses its flavor. Being salt of the earth means that we are called to give that salt to everyone, to bring out the flavor of the earth from everyone, Christian and non-Christian alike. We are the light of the world. That means that if you took every single candle that we have in our hands, however many people in this chat room, and you took those candles and you put them in one single room, once you got beyond 2-3 candles, there's no more addition of light. The place is saturated by light. Everyone else is useless. We are not called to be the light of one parish, one family. We are called to bring that light to everyone around us. A room that is overlit, no benefit. A piece of steak that is oversalted, disgusting. And so this is the time now with this pandemic that we bring peace to all of those around us. Not just our families, not just our immediate families, our parishes, our churches, but everyone. This is the time that we witness. This is the time that we become truly the salt of the earth, truly the light of the world. This is the time when our humility, our stillness in the face of tribulation creates that oil to soothe the relational frictions of the people around us. So that we are not the ones fighting over toilet paper, we are the ones finding people toilet paper. You know, Origen, I'm going to call him Saint Origin, is when he was talking about the martyrdoms in the early church, he says that at one point they came back after burying people. So they had just buried the martyrs, and he'd come back into the church, and so he's speaking and saying to them, "This is our true witness." The word martyr, materia. This is our true witness, that we are still in the face of tribulation. And then he says to the catechumens, "You catechumens, you're being instructed in the faith. You're being prepared for baptism by many lectures and many talks and many other things." He goes, "But today, witnessing these martyrs, seeing them be still in the face of their own martyrdom, you have heard a million lessons. You have been convinced the faith of Christ more than 1,000 words." And I think that is something for all of us to take, really something. This is our time to witness. In the 3rd century, when there's pandemics descending upon Alexandria, the pagans left the city. The Christians didn't leave the city. The Christians tended to the pagans, to the sick, to the dying, to the extent that many of them died. This is our witness. Julian the Apostate, when he writes, and he was a pagan, in his accusations against the pagans, says to the pagans, "Why is it that the Christians care for the sick? Why are they caring for us? Why don't we do this?" So even a pagan was witnessing what the Christians are doing. This is our chance for witness. This is our chance to become the salt of the earth. This is our chance to become the light of the world. Let all of us, in our own ways, in our own capacity, remember that. Bring comfort to people around you. Bring peace to people around you. Because in doing so, as I said, humility is both forged in crisis, but at the same time, humility creates an oil to deal with that crisis. And we're all called to do that, just as Pope Kyrillos was called to do that. God bless you all. Forgive me for talking for so long.
Thank you, Abuna, so much. That was wonderful. And I keep getting private messages saying, "This is amazing. This is wonderful. This is beautiful." I want to open up the floor for questions. Abuna, if it's okay with you, I would love for you to speak a little bit about St. Cyril Theological College, a little bit more, but later after,
Sure.
so that way we stay on topic,
Sure.
because I'm sure a lot of people would be interested to, I don't know if there are online courses and stuff, but it would be a great blessing
Sure.
if there's access. So let's, I guess, go through. I think people can manually unmute themselves if they want to ask a question, but we have to maintain control. That's one. Two, there are people that text the question inside the chat. So let me find that first one. The first one is by Mina Hanna. If humility starts with humiliation, is there a distinction between humility and a weak personality? A distinction between humility and a weak personality.
Yes, I mean, look, it's a great question. I think the link that he's trying to get at is if somebody has a weak personality, they'll often be humiliated, if I can understand that correctly. I think it doesn't really matter what type of personality we have. Humanity, especially in Western society, judges personalities according to strength. God doesn't judge personalities according to strength. He judges us as our humans, as how we are in his image. And that means that I can have a weak personality and be humiliated because of that. And I will need to bear that. But I can have a strong personality and be humiliated, and it's much harder to bear the humiliation because I have the capacity to rebuff it. And so each of us in our own way, with our own personality distinctions, needs to bear humiliation in order to forge humility. Now, that's really important. Often a question that gets asked with that is, should I then be a doormat? Should I then be exploited? I'm not talking here about pathological abuse. I'm not talking here about an abusive husband. I'm not talking here about any of those kind of situations. We are firm, we accept what is truth, and we always speak the truth in love. Yeah? And we should never tolerate an injustice like that. What I am saying, though, in the 99.95% of challenges to our humility, they're not pathological abuse. They're just somebody cutting in front of me. They're somebody putting me down. There's somebody, not giving me what I have the right to have. And that's what we struggle with the most. And they're the chances the times that we have to exhibit that humility.
There's also an option to raise your hand to ask a question. Again, if that's preferred, that way we could unmute you as well. It'll be a little more orderly. There's a question here. It's on the topic of humility because there's another question from Kyrillos Shahat, but I'm going to stick to the humility question. Michael Risk is asking, how can we help people find humility when they are drowning in fear during hold on a second, during these challenging times? How do we get them to find the strength?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think the only way you can get people to find humility, which if we define as St. Isaac the Syrian does as an inner stillness in the face of tribulation, then just as we develop inner stillness by putting on the humility of God, by participating in Him, participating in His own humility, likewise, if we give them that and they see the stillness of Christ in us, they will then participate in that in us as well. And so I think the only thing we can do is to give peace to people by ourselves becoming peaceful. And like I said, that's what the meaning of salt of the earth is. That's what meaning is of, for example, Saint Seraphim of Sarov, who says, find peace and thousands around you will find salvation. If we ourselves do this, that is what spreads the peace. And so how do we get them to find the strength? Very simple. We find it ourselves, and then it becomes something that is probably more infectious, more contagious, and more virulent than even coronavirus.
A lot of questions on humility. Next question. Hi, Abuna. My question, this is from Kyrillos Butros. Hi, Abuna. My question is that if you try to forge or pursue humility, how can you not wait, that's the one I just asked, I believe. Oh, that's why. Okay. No, that's not the first. Okay. Hi, Abuna. My question is that if you try to forge or pursue humility, how can you not lose yourself in the process and defeat the purpose of trying to pursue those beginning stages of humility?
I'm not sure I quite understood the beginning part of that question.
So I believe the follow-up, the following question is a lot shorter, and I believe it's the same question. How do you attain humility without losing humility?
Okay. How do you attain humility without losing humility? I think, look, like everything else, like our Lord teaches us, we begin in the small things. We become faithful in the small things. And that means that if in the small things, I see what's happening inside my heart, I discern, I expose my heart to my confession father, to my spiritual father, then very quickly I'll start to appreciate certain things. So for example, I notice that I break a nail, my little fingernail, and all of a sudden my world is panicked. Instead of just tolerating that and realizing, oh, I've just panicked, stop. Take that to God in prayer. Sit with yourself, sit with your confession and say, why am I so shaken by such stupid little things? Why am I so disturbed? What exercises can I have in order to overcome this? Same thing, for example, you're a guy, you like a girl. You smile at the girl, she doesn't smile back at you. And all of a sudden your world is destroyed. For the first time ever, someone doesn't want you. Why are you so disturbed? Why are you so disturbed? Analyze those feelings, sit with them and offer them to the Lord and say, my Lord, give me strength. If humility is not something that I can just create, but humility is me putting on your humility, Christ, then I ask you for your presence. I ask you for your peace. If we truly understand that humility, there is only one true source of humility, that is Christ, then that means I can't take that humility. I can't wear that humility unless I'm in His presence, unless I come near Him. And so I think attaining humility, you won't lose humility. It's very simple. If you truly are trying to be humble in terms of being still in the face of tribulation, by drawing near to Christ, by exposing that lack of humility to your confession father, then we will all start on that path. But we do it in the little things. It's very hard to be still in the face of a cancer diagnosis. It's very easy to be still in the face of having a pop tire or not being able to get 3 toilet paper rolls. And so we can all then look at our different ways of starting on the very small things to develop that humility. And to stop when I haven't had the capacity to be humble, to stop and say, my Lord, forgive me, give me the strength next time that when I'm faced by this situation to be a bit more humble.
Okay. Next is Kyrillos Zaire. He is raising his hand. He will need to unmute himself. I thought I had the power to do that. I don't have it. Okay, he's unmuted.
Hi, Abuna. Thank you for the wonderful talk. I just had a question. So about attaining humility, is this something that needs to happen through suffering, or are there ways that we can do this ourselves? So like, I know a lot of times us putting ourselves down really doesn't produce the humility that's necessary. But how are more practical ways that we can do in our everyday lives to attain this humility or the supernatural humility?
Yeah, great question. I mean, if you observe then that kind of definition of humility, of stillness in the face of tribulation, that comes very close then to the idea of martyrdom, that they have laying down my life and to be co-crucified with Christ. And you find that they actually overlap. And so when you read in St. Isaac the Syrian, as well as many of the other desert literature, as well as in many of the fathers, those two concepts come very close together, because Christ is himself the one that was silent, or Christ is the one that didn't open his mouth, Christ is the one that was still in the face of his own crucifixion, which we are called to share in. There's a very interesting account, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, in the life of Anthony, where the persecution descends upon Alexandria, and so he then returns into the city to be a martyr. And as he enters into the city to become a martyr, he gets distracted by the prisoners that are waiting to be martyred themselves. And so he starts tending to their wounds because they've been beaten. He starts caring for them, cooking for them, feeding them, serving them, until he's there for so long that the persecution stops. And so he misses out on his own chance to be martyred. And so after he tends to all these people and the persecution has stopped, he then returns back into the desert. St. Athanasius writes that then he returned into the desert, failing to be a martyr, and yet he returned into the desert to be daily a martyr. And so then there is the tribulation that comes upon me unwillingly, involuntarily, okay, that forges that humility. Coronavirus, sickness, disease, business collapse, whatever it may be. But there is also the chance for us to be martyred each day, to be co-crucified with Christ each day, that is voluntary, through our daily lying down our lives, through daily not screaming at my kids when they drive me insane when I have to homeschool them, through not giving in to anger when my wife is frustrating me, through bowing down in front of hierarchy even though I disagree with them, through humbling myself in the service with my fellow priest, through humbling myself in my service with my fellow servant that's with me. All of these are chances for me to lay down my life, to become a martyr. And I honestly believe, especially now, there are many struggles that will come upon us, whether it's physical disease, whether it's our finances, our businesses collapsing, whatever it may be. But, I was just reading the newspaper this morning, and the domestic violence council of Australia was saying our biggest fear is the peak of domestic violence that will happen in this time, when people are stuck at home. And that's a reminder for us all that when we were married, we were told, husbands do this, wives do this. But we forget what was said to the husband: lay down your life as Christ laid down his life for the church, to be martyred. When we are parenting, for those that are parents among us here, that is a martyrdom. That is a daily martyrdom. And so that is when we forge humility. And we all have opportunities for those. I had at least 17 opportunities for that this morning, and I probably failed in about 14 of them with my kids. But it's a chance. It's a chance. It's a chance.
Follow-up question from Kyrillos Boutros, which I'm going to find. Where do we draw the distinction between being still and being naive?
Being still and being naive? Well, I think it's a matter of discernment. So naive means generally I probably don't even have insight into the fact that I'm not reacting to something around me. Whereas still means I understand the danger. I understand exactly what's happening around me. But I'm struggling to be still in the face of that tribulation. And part of that, as I said, it's not a perfect art where all of a sudden I'm shaken. I get sick and I'm unshaken. No, it's something that I offer to the Lord, and I keep standing with him, asking him for his humility, asking him for his presence, asking for his peace to come into my heart. There's one letter that Pope Kyrillos wrote to one of his brothers. Where, when he was
Someone is talking. If you're unmuted, I think it's Mike. Can you mute? Thanks.
And so he writes the letter to his brother, and I think it was in the mid-1960s when he was being attacked a lot by the newspapers, as well as the lay community council. And he wrote to his brother and said to him, I've wanted to write to you for 15 days, but I haven't been able to. Such has been the multitude of my anxieties.
Wow.
And then he quotes one of the Psalms and says, but even in the multitude of my anxieties, the Lord is with me, and comforts me. And so that means even for Pope Kyrillos, he would have struggled. He would have struggled with the anxieties of certain situations. But in prayer, in coming and drawing near to the only true source of humility, he puts on the peace of Christ. He wears the peace of Christ that slowly chases away that darkness and chases away that lack of peace. And I think that's something that all of us have to do on a daily basis.
And next
Thank you,
question.
Bruno.
Thank you. Next question is Anthony Doss. He has his hand raised. He just has to unmute himself before asking the question.
Thank you, Bruno, for the time. I just had a question regarding page 76 from the book. It was a quote from Father Alexander Schmemann when you were talking about Father Mina's Eucharistic understanding or Eucharistic vision.
Sure.
I can read the quote, or if you remember it well. If you could explain the quote and how it fit in that context.
Yeah, I wrote it, but I can't remember anything I write, so just read it for me.
Sure. For the early Christians, the body of Christ is on the altar because he is among them. For the contemporary Christians, Christ is here because his body is on the altar. It seems to be analogous, but in fact there is an essential difference between the early Christians and us. For them, everything is in knowing Christ, loving him. For us, everything is in the desire to be enlightened.
Yeah, sure. So I think Father Alexander Schmemann, I didn't write the words, Father Alexander Schmemann did, but I suspect his meaning is that for the early church, the significance of the body and the blood of Christ, the bread and the wine that is transformed to the body and blood of Christ, is that he is among us. That because he is present among us, because he's before us in the altar, we commune through these gifts. Whereas for contemporary Christians, the significance is more the body and the blood on the altar than the presence of Christ. The fact that we almost make the body and the blood almost into an idol sometimes, not understanding that the whole point is that Christ is among us, and so we commune through these gifts, not that by communing these gifts we somehow come into the presence of God. And so it's a subtle philosophical point, but his point is that for the early Christians, everything was in knowing Christ, encountering Christ, loving him. Whereas for us, contemporary sometimes, at least in his world, the desire is to be enlightened, is that I want to come to know God through things around me. I want to do something in order to come to know him. Whereas for the early Christians, it was kind of in the reverse. He was among us, we were in his presence, and we commune in the Eucharistic gifts because he's among us.
I see. And the context here was that Father Mina's understanding was that of the early
Exactly.
Christians.
Exactly, that for him in the Eucharist, everything was not about being enlightened. It wasn't about somehow getting some kind of spiritual grace more than other people. It was purely in encountering Christ.
Oh, thank you.
So that's why every time he was before the altar, that was his only feeling, that I'm before my Christ.
Okay.
Which is, again, one of the interesting points that Father Rafael Avamino once mentioned. He said that Pope Kyrillos was silent. He didn't speak about his problems to anyone. He didn't discuss what was in his heart with anyone. To the extent, and I mentioned in the book, that no one even knew his mother's name. No one even knew his mother's name. They struggled to remember his mother's name because he didn't talk about things that were affecting him. And I discovered that pretty early on, that very few people could give me a sense of the inner personality of Pope Kyrillos because they didn't know it. He didn't have conversations with people. But Father Rafael Avamino said that, but when you saw him at the altar, he put his head down and his lips, even when he wasn't praying, like an audible part of the liturgy, wouldn't stop moving because he was before Christ. And so whereas he may not have discussed his problems with people, he certainly discussed them with Christ.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, I'm going to go back. Kyrillos Shahat asked a question very early on. He wrote, I thought Pope Shenouda had at least one instance of being an anchorite. I think he probably meant Pope Kyrillos. And Kyrillos, you could definitely join in and mention if you meant Pope Shenouda or Pope Kyrillos.
No, I meant Pope Shenouda.
Okay.
Yeah, so I didn't say he wasn't an anchorite. So they all were. So Abuna Matthew Meskin, Pope Shenouda, and Pope Kyrillos, all of them had experiences of being anchorites at certain points. Is that what you're referring to? When I said that all of them were influenced by, all of them went into solitude, and all of them were influenced by Isaac the Syrian?
No, you're talking about patriarchs before Pope Kyrillos that didn't perform miracles, and even some after him. That's what I was.
Sorry. Are you saying? Yeah, I'm not saying that Pope Shenouda didn't do any miracles at all. I'm just saying he wasn't known as a miracle performer, so it wasn't something that was defining of his ministry. And so even when it comes to these miracles, I know some people do mention that there might have been 3 or 4 miracles or something like that. I don't know. I have nothing to do. I'm not sure. All I'm saying is that he was not a prolific miracle performer, whereas Pope Kyrillos literally. When you meet anyone that came into contact with him, there was some experience. And I'm, before priesthood, I was a medical doctor, so I'm a huge skeptic, which is one of my weaknesses. But the reality is, even if you throw away 90% of the miracles that were performed by Pope Kyrillos, there are still 10% of stuff that is very hard to discount. And so I guess my point is that he was an anomaly. Doing miracles at that time was something very unusual. It was very unusual. People weren't superstitious. They didn't just believe anything that happened to be a miracle. They were just as skeptical as we are today. And it was an anomaly.
Okay, Robbie Aziz has his hand raised. Robbie, just unmute your phone and you could ask.
Thanks. Well, firstly, I want to just a deep thank you for writing a text that's not only edifying in nature, but also really granular and thorough in its historical and its cultural and its theological perspective. So I just really appreciate the amount of effort and the diligence that went into putting together a piece like this. My question is about the life of Father Mina the Recluse and kind of how we reconcile that with the Father Mina that we meet, who lived in the city of Cairo amongst his disciples and amongst his students. Do we reconcile these two? Because when you juxtapose them, they seem to be kind of at antithesis with each other. Is the idea here that he created his own internal solitude, and that's kind of how he was able to live in the city, even though he was longing for time by himself? And to that extent, for many of us that are living in New York City or living in larger cities, and in what ways can we manifest that same ideology within the context of our somewhat busy lives so that we can kind of inherit some of those same virtues?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think that's something that I did talk about in the book, that his means of maintaining solitude were silence. So that was his specific means, following the example of St. Isaac the Syrian and St. Arsenius the Great. Certainly, in terms of being a recluse, he considered himself to be a recluse. And so at one point, people were getting upset with him because when he was living in the outskirts of Cairo
Sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry? I'll go ahead. Okay. At one point, people were even accusing him, saying, how are you a recluse if you're living in the outskirts of Allah in St. Mina's church? How are you being a recluse? And so he wrote to his brother a really interesting letter saying to his brother, can you please publish in Ahram newspaper that Father Mina the Recluse will refrain from calling himself the recluse until he returns back to being a recluse. So, in terms of, if that's what people want, that's what I'll say. But he saw himself as a recluse. He saw himself as someone who lived solitude or solitary. And that's because he had the internalized desert. He lived in an internalized desert. And that's a very strange concept for us. That's a very strange concept for us. I think it was Anna Syncletica, one of the desert mothers, that says, you can live in a crowd of your thoughts in the middle of the desert, or you can live in a crowd of men with silence, and be in solitude, even in a crowd around you. And the difference is then our minds, our hearts, our prayers, and each one of us is called to live that solitude in a different way. And part of that is silence, like actual physical silence, not just a silence in terms of not speaking, but a physical silence. And I guess that's why now it's become quite popular to speak about quiet time, about times of reflection, times of peace, because we do live in very, very busy worlds, especially New York City or Sydney or wherever else. There's headache. I mean, as a priest, it's my phone is literally a noise highway. And so learning to then take time out to stop. And we all have the capacity to do that. We all have the capacity that when we're sitting on, if we're driving a car, to just not play music, to not make phone calls. We all have the capacity to spend half an hour at the end of the day in absolute silence before an icon of Christ. These are all ways that we have the capacity to achieve that silence, that solitude in the world. Because truly, you're right. If we are going along and going through the path of our lives as everyone does, you will not have any solitude or silence at all. Every moment of silence is filled with a distraction, is filled with something that most likely is going to be sin. If not sin, it's a form of pleasure. If it's not a form of pleasure, it's just a form of distraction. There's always something to fill our time. There's shopping, there's TV, there's Netflix, there's our phones. Something will steal our silence. Something will steal our solitude. And so we have to then be quite intentional, quite radical in carving out times of our lives to create that peace, to create that solitude where we can stop and just be in front of the presence of God. And each of us can do that in different ways. Each of us can do it. Some people do it through the Jesus prayer. Each of us do it in our own way.
A question here from Mina Kyrillos. How do you believe Pope Kyrillos was able to surround himself with constant opposition and not become despondent or depressed?
It's a good question. So, when I mentioned that comment about surrounding himself with people like his brother and certain disciples that would always kind of challenge him on things, that doesn't mean that they hated him. That doesn't mean that they were against him. That doesn't mean that they were angry or negative people around him. It just means they opposed him. They disagreed with him. I won't say who, but I was once told by a bishop in Egypt, if you ever form a committee, make sure that at least 50% of the committee agree with you before you invite them to be in the committee. And I remember listening to that going, yeah, it doesn't really sound right to me. It doesn't really stick. But that's sometimes what we do. We surround our people with surround ourselves with yes people that agree with us in everything we do. Our friends, we only hang out with those people that agree with us. And anytime someone disagrees with us, we throw them away. Maybe rather it's an opportunity for us to surround ourselves with still people that aren't like negative and they're not angry people that are infectious in that regard, but people that may have a challenging perspective, may keep us on our toes, may make us think. That's something that as priests we sometimes do well to do, is that in our services that we keep people with us that may challenge us, so that we can always be constantly articulating what we're doing and why we're doing it. And so I do agree with you. If you surround yourself with negative people that are always attacking you and angry and frustrated, you'll become negative and angry and frustrated. I don't think that was the point I was trying to make. But either way, he had plenty of that anyway from those, whether he kept them around himself or not.
Okay. Question. It's a lot of Una. Get ready.
No, go for it.
Okay. What is the difference between humility and popular practices like mindfulness? And you just touched on it pretty much. Like mindfulness, if both are about achieving stillness.
Yeah. So look, mindfulness is great. I don't see any issue with it. Mindfulness is actually a trait or an exercise that comes from the desert. The active method of being in the moment. I see no issues with that whatsoever. However, if you notice everything that St. Isaac the Syrian says, there's a difference between natural and supernatural humility. Likewise, there's a difference between natural and supernatural mindfulness. One of them makes me attuned to nature, makes me attuned to the moment, makes me a bit attuned to what is happening right now. And that has value, especially with people that have, pathological mental health, whether depression, anxiety, whatever it may be. There are benefits to doing that. Supernatural mindfulness, if you want to use that, which is what inner stillness is where I am still and I am humble and I am mindful, but I'm mindful in the presence of Christ. So I'm not just being mindful of the moment, I'm being mindful of the moment so that I can experience and encounter Christ. And they're two separate things. It's like, for example, saying, the peace that we receive when we go up on Mount Tibet or some, Mount Everest or, some beautiful piece of ocean that I shouldn't be swimming in. When you're in those kind of situations, you experience peace. When I'm in the water, I experience a peace that is quite incredible. Christ says to us, my peace is not of this world. And so that means that the peace that we receive, even in those situations on some beautiful mountaintop, in the most mindful moment, in some kind of mantra, whatever it may be, whatever peace I'm experiencing in that moment is not Christ's peace. Because Christ's peace is not of this world. It cannot be extracted from this world. It's only from him. And that's why he says to us very clearly, Be at peace, you know. In the world you'll have tribulation. In me you'll have peace. But be of good cheer, I have overcome the world. So he's saying to us, you're guaranteed to have tribulation, but the only true source of peace is me. So mindfulness may help us in our mental health, may help us in other things like that, may help us relax us. But that, again, is a little bit different to the peace of Christ that comes to us and fills our hearts, that gives us the capacity to bear things that are impossible to bear no matter how good your mental health is. And I think that's the difference. But sure, I have no issues with mindfulness and these exercises. They can be quite helpful. If you're smart, use those exercises, but then bring them or baptize them or bring them into the presence of Christ. And then they'll be much more beneficial. You know, same thing with exercise. Exercise as much as you want, but try maybe when you're going for a walk, for example, listen to a sermon, listen to a hymn. Then you're all of a sudden baptizing what is a very beneficial exercise and bring it into the presence of Christ as well.
Okay. Next question is from Mark W. How do you distinguish between panic buying and being responsible and preparing for your family? I guess that refers to the toilet paper. And
yeah. Did my wife ask that question?
I think it was my wife that asked the question.
It's a very good question. I mean, because at the same time, that's what panic buying is, right? Is because everyone else is buying. So it's not that I'm panic buying because I want to stockpile. It's because everyone else is buying, and so I need to buy as well. And so that makes us all panic. And so I think we'd be responsible. I'm not sure what it's like in New York, but in Australia, our supermarkets have now introduced restrictions. So it's one per person. So everyone can get, I think it's 8 toilet rolls per person every time you shop. And so I think you do that. And I think you'd be wise to realize there may be some restrictions. But again, you follow the government, you listen to those restrictions, and you care for those around you. And so, for example, if you somehow got 2 boxes of toilet paper rolls rather than 1, then share that with your neighbors. You know, share that with people that may be in need. And then, as I said, that will kind of, you know, short circuit or discharge that panic buying, selfish kind of mechanism that exists in all of us, and, you know, turn it so that I care for other people as well.
Okay. Next question is from Emir Butros. Speaking of the Eucharist, there are restrictions on liturgies, at least in the United States. And also in Australia, I learned from you, Abuna.
Yes, exactly.
Today, because of the virus, what is your insight about keeping the flame ignited while keeping everyone safe via social distancing? Thanks a lot.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I'm not a bishop, so thank God I don't have to make these kind of decisions. But I think it's very simple. It's very simple. We have to understand that what we are doing is not because we're being persecuted. What we are doing is not because the virus is Satan. What we are doing is because it is a pandemic. It happens every 50 years, every 60 years. It's part of life. You know, there are mutations in viruses and they affect us. And we know now with modern medicine that we have to keep ourselves separate. We know they have to keep certain precautions. Just as many of us, for example, who travel overseas and went to Europe for 4 weeks didn't have communion, it wasn't much of an issue then. It's not going to be much of an issue now. Your faith, your relationship with Christ does not change. It doesn't change. And maybe all of this is for us to realize it doesn't change. Maybe this is a chance for all of us again to strip back and to realize why we're in church, why we're following God. Is it because we're encountering Christ, or because we're doing what we were always doing? We're doing what our families have taught us to do. We're doing what our culture does. We're doing what is a social norm in our group. Or really, we're encountering Christ. And if our interest is encountering Christ, then we encounter Christ at home. We're not staying away from the Eucharist willingly. We're not staying away from the Eucharist because this is our choice. We're doing it because we have no choice. And so the church in her wisdom is then asking or restricting everybody from praying liturgies because, and this is not a question about communion and about whether the virus can be transmitted via communion. The reality is, from a medical perspective, if you are standing in a room with 200 other people for 3 hours or 2 hours, breathing their air, singing as loud as we love to sing, then you will commune in that virus before you come to the cup. And so I think the church in her wisdom is asking us all to keep that level of separation in order that we do our part, you know, in protecting our neighbor. And so it's a deeply Christian act in what we're doing by keeping our distance. In terms of keeping the flame ignited, we have different ways. So I know that many of the parishes are live streaming liturgy. Is that what you guys are doing as well, Father? where one priest is praying with one deacon, or there's no liturgies at all?
No, at home, at home. The churches are to be honest, in solidarity with everyone. We're restricting, at least in the Northeast diocese and the Archdiocese, from praying in the liturgy, because different towns, different states have different rules. So.
Sure. So I mean, in Australia at the moment, at least in the Sydney diocese, we are still praying a liturgy with just one deacon, which can be live streamed if we wish. And I guess the idea of that is that is then offering up the Eucharist on behalf of the people. But even that may change in the next week. That I expect that there will be further restrictions, and we won't be able to leave our homes for those kind of non-essential things. And so. And again, we encounter Christ in our own ways. We keep doing different things, The church is very creative. The fathers are very creative. The laity are extremely creative in coming up with solutions for us. And so you guys have been doing this probably, I think, for a week more than us. And so we are just experiencing this as of yesterday. Mm-hmm. And so I'm really surprised at the beauty of the laity and coming up with some really incredible ways to serve the kids, to do Bible studies, to do praises together. And so we keep the flame, each one of us then, as everyone is sharing a quote around of what happened with one of in the 14th century, 15th century, you close a church, you just open thousands of churches in people's homes. Each of us is called to be a priest. Each of us is called to offer the sacrifice on the altar of our hearts. Each of us is called to then really bring our families into the encounter with Christ. And so we all do that in our own ways. And our fathers, I'm sure Father Gregory especially is really giving you some beautiful ways on how you can do that.
Okay, next question. Andrew A. Why do you believe so many of us, Coptic and now Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, etc., love Saint Pope Kyrillos, although we have not seen him or met him?
That's a good question. Look, I'll tell you in my own life that, when I was probably 19, 20, and being a little bit of an arrogant, loud kid, I was resisting having Pope Kyrillos as a patron saint purely on the fact that everyone had him as a patron saint, and I didn't want him as a patron saint. And so I had, some funky saints like Arsenius the Grey, Isaac the Syrian. I had all these other saints that no one else had, just so I could be a bit different. And then I remember I was on a highway on the way to my exam. And I was, I think, sitting in first year engineering a long time ago before I did medicine. And as I was sitting in the car, the highway stopped. There was an accident. And so I was stuck in the congestion. And my car was on and we're moving very slowly. And then I had a really old, bad car. And so it started overheating. And it got to the extent where the engine was about to blow and it was on absolute heat. And I was in a panic situation because I had to get to uni. I had an exam to sit. I was stuck in congestion. And so I was like, And I started asking all these saints and nothing was working. And then I said, all right, Pope Kyrillos, just help me. All of a sudden, I saw the thing go down. I thought, that's really odd. And again, being a skeptic, I didn't really trust in it too much. And then I got to fourth year engineering. And as I was sitting in fourth year engineering, I was doing my thesis. And so we had to create some huge hardware solution. And so 1 hour before we submitted and we went to demonstrate it, it just started pumping out weird code to the screen that we couldn't explain. It had been working for a month and then all of a sudden just stopped working. And so I was in a room with my partner on the thesis, who was a Greek Orthodox young guy who didn't go to church and didn't care about God. And so we were in panic. We spent an hour trying to do anything we could. And then again, I said, all right, Pope Kyrillos. Literally, as I mentioned the words, the code stopped. And so my friend looked at the screen and said, what'd you do? I said, you're not going to like it. And he goes, well, I go, I'll explain it, but you're not going to like it. And so that's when I started to realize, I don't know what it is. Like, there's something very special about him. There's something, and I say this as a skeptic. But you're right. Many people have been deeply affected by him. And this is well before the book. I mean, I remember as a GP, before priesthood, I was a general practitioner of family medicine. And I had a patient who came in who was Maltese, married to an Australian lady. And so he said to me, I've got some adoption paperwork. Can you fill it out for me? And I said to him, yeah, of course. I said, but don't you have another child? And he said to me, yeah, I do. But, I've always wanted 2 children and we've been trying IVF for the last 8 years. fertility. I don't know. Do you guys have IVF in America? I'm sure you do. I don't know what you call it, fertility, reproduction.
Yeah,
stuff.
IVF.
Yeah. Okay. And so he goes, so we tried for 8 years, and then we've spent the last 2 years just giving up. You know, we don't use any form of protection. We're just not going to have children. We want a second child, and we have a lot of love to give. I said, that's a beautiful thing. And so I started filling out the adoption paperwork. And then I said to him, but you know what? No, but, you know, there's always hope. And he said to me, explain, what do you mean? And I said, look, on my printer, I had a picture of Pope Kyrillos visiting people in one of the hospitals in Ethiopia. And I said to him, see that picture, that photo over there? That guy over there, there's been many, many cases where people would come to him and they'd be panicked and they couldn't have children. And this is pre-IVF days. And then he'd say to them, you know, in 9 months' time, you'll have a baby or whatever else. And he said to me, oh, okay. He goes, what was his name? I said, Pope Kyrillos. He said, oh, okay. And that was it. I didn't mention another word. And so he went home, and then I didn't see him again for about 3 months. And then he came back to me, and I said to him, how did you go with adoption? Did you adopt that child? He goes, oh, no. My wife is pregnant. I said, did you guys do another cycle of IVF? And he goes, no. He goes, that night I went home, I looked at Wikipedia, and I started researching Pope Kyrillos. And then I said to myself, you know what? If he did it back then, and he's a saint, he should be able to do it now. And he goes, this guy doesn't go to church, no faith at all. He's a Catholic background, but never went to church. So he said, Pope Kyrillos, if you exist, help my wife fall pregnant. And he goes, and that was it. And I thought it was just a stupid thought in my head, so I ignored it. Then my wife missed a period. And so we went and did a dating ultrasound because we had no idea how could she fall pregnant. And the dating ultrasound showed that the date of conception was the day that I asked Pope Kyrillos to help. And so I said, well, that's a bit remarkable. He goes, oh, I know. So his wife came and saw me. When his wife came in, I said to her, that's remarkable what happened, right? She said, oh, don't listen to my husband. Good things just happen to good people. And I said, oh, no. How do you explain these things? And so I think his life, beyond even the miracles, speaks to people in ways that is quite remarkable. His form of, ascetic leadership, which is something that we as fathers and clergy, but all of us in our own kind of careers, need to learn, that his way of leadership was not about fierceness. It was not about casting fear into people's hearts. It was about praying for them, loving them and forgiving them regardless. And that form of ascetic leadership, I think, is something that speaks very deeply, especially to the kind of churches at the moment. And the idea of solitude, the idea of love, and the idea of prayer is something remarkable. He was an anomaly of a human being. You know, when I was working on my thesis on him, I had a Dutch supervisor, and she said to me, she's not Orthodox, she said to me, I don't think there's been a life like his, possibly in the last 500 years. He was an anomaly of a human being. I'm not saying that as in he's someone that we could never reach. No, he's an example for us. We could all become like him. What I'm saying, though, is he's an anomaly. You know, St. Isaac the Syrian speaks about there are scarcely a man in every generation that meets it or finds a certain level of prayer. He goes, but then there is one very rare that experiences God in that kind of remarkable way. And so I think Pope Kyrillos is that person. And you see them scattered throughout the world. You see them scattered, and forgive me, they're not just Coptic. You see them scattered throughout the world. You see people like, Saint Seraphim of Sorol. You see people like Padre Pio in the Catholic Church. You see people like Mother Teresa. You see people like, Pope Kyrillos. These kind of figures that are kind of scattered throughout the 19th, 20th, 21st centuries are anomalies, and they have deep impacts on people well beyond our borders.
Okay. Since we're on the topic of miracles, what is the greatest miracle you've heard of Pope Kyrillos? I mean, this one is pretty big, the one with your client or your patient.
Yeah. I mean, look, like I said, you'll have noticed if you've read the book, I don't actually focus too much on miracles. It's not something that I'm too concerned about. I think it's much more important that we look at the virtue that kind of underlies those miracles. But the reality is the man was a miracle performer with some really incredible stories. I won't tell you the greatest one because I'm not no one to judge what is the greatest or not, but I'll tell you a funny one. my confession father, who shall remain unnamed, tells me that when he was in 1968, when Pope Kyrillos had suspended Pope Shenouda for various reasons, and he was serving out his suspension in one of the monasteries. He goes, he was a student of Pope Shenouda, or Bishop Shenouda at the time, and so he was furious, and he heard from his Sunday school teachers that Pope Kyrillos was a sorcerer, and now Pope Kyrillos had suspended Bishop Shenouda, and so he was like, I was furious, and so he goes, so I was walking through the cathedral, and Pope Kyrillos was about 300-400 meters away from me, and I was walking with one of my friends, and so my friend said to me, please, let's go kiss his hand. He said, I'm not kissing his hand. He goes, Jesus wouldn't let us kiss his hand like he lets us kiss his hand. Who does he think he is? And how dare he do that to Bishop Shenouda? And la 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 la. So he goes, and so I refused. And so he goes, maybe 15 minutes later, we were walking through a courtyard, and it happened to be that Pope Kyrillos was crossing our path. Now, Pope Kyrillos was hundreds of meters away before, so he couldn't have heard this conversation. Pope Kyrillos then walked through the whole group and walked directly to my confession father, who was then a young man, and then walked to him, put his hand out, and then pushed his hand into his face and goes like this. He goes, you don't want to kiss my hand? And so then my confession father said to me, he goes, I then became so happy. I said, why? He goes, God was speaking to Pope Kyrillos about me. and so he goes like, there's no explanation. There's no explanation. He was a remarkable man. He was a light to us all, and also really a model for us all, really a deep model for us all, that we need to start really focusing on encountering Christ in everything that we do. And also to remember, if we truly encounter Christ, it changes the way we do everything. It changes the way we lead our churches. It changes the way we deal with people. It means that we have to forgive everything all the time. There's no question about it. And that's the one thing that is so clear in Pope Kyrillos' life. Never once would he not forgive somebody. Everybody was forgiven. It doesn't matter what they did, how they did it, what happened. That's all they did. And I think that's a model for us all.
Next question from John Macarius. Hi, Abuna. Pope Kyrillos enjoyed life in solitude because he chose it of his own will. As for us, we were forced into solitude. How can we enjoy the spirituality of solitude if it was forced rather than chosen?
So in terms of coronavirus at the moment, you mean?
Yeah. That's my guess, yeah.
Yeah. So I was walking with a friend of mine who's an elderly priest, and I said to him, and he said to me, I'm looking forward to this time of solitude. And I said to him, yeah, because you haven't got kids. And so sometimes that's the harder part about it, is that yes, we're in solitude, and if we are by ourselves, or we're with just unmarried, or with a wife or a husband, then it is a great chance for solitude, in terms of a chance of real deep prayer, a chance to be a bit more quiet, not a chance to watch more Netflix and kind of binge watching everything. But for those of us that have kids or big houses, or lots of family inside the house with us, it's a chance for solitude as well for all of us. But it's just harder. We just have to be a little bit more creative. And so we do things as a family, maybe create times of silence for the kids to go in their rooms. A routine. It's not without reason that monasticism in their monasteries have a very clear-cut routine of how to deal with their time. It's because if you don't put a clear routine in your time, you end up doing nothing, or at least not productive things. And so maybe it's an idea, and this is one out for the parents out there, is that you create a schedule, and a schedule involves certain times of prayer, certain times of solitude, certain times of just quiet time, certain times of exercise, so that we can benefit from this time and use this time and redeem it, as St. Paul says. We transform this time, so it's not wasted, but rather it's a chance for encounter. It's also a chance that when we're stuck at home and possibly can't go out, that we then connect with people a lot more. Yes, we're in solitude, but we're called to give the fruits of that solitude to other people, to check on people, to bring peace to them. So I think all of us in our own ways need to do things, but we be creative, and we kind of have a bit of a strict routine so that we don't end up wasting this time. Because as we all know, one of the quickest things that, as C.S. Lewis says, is we escape from pain and run to pleasure. And so, when we're sitting at home in our rooms by ourselves, often, we can be overcome by certain temptations. And so the way to protect ourselves from that is by guarding ourselves, is by creating the presence of God in our houses.
Another question, Kyrillos has hand raised. Kyrillos, if you can unmute your, There you go.
talks about, the presence of God, and silence obviously has a very big portion to do with practicing the presence of God. You know, how do you see, or maybe in your own experience of what you've seen in your research in Pope Kyrillos, how did he actively sit in the presence of God, even in the Patriarchate being so kind of mobbed by so many people?
Yes, I think it was the same thing. So he used to carve out his time. So his day began very early. So he would begin at 2 a.m. or something thereabouts. With psalmody, tasbih, and then matins and the liturgy. And so in those quiet times, there was no one to bother him, and so he would pray. He had a very interesting practice, which was he'd get very, very frustrated if somebody tried to concelebrate with him. So if there was a priest that wanted to pray with him, he'd tell him, "There's another altar in the other church over there. Go pray over there." So none of it, I came to pray with you. He goes, "Yeah, that's fine. There's another altar over there. Go pray over there." And so he'd become quite upset, actually, if people would pray with him. And so he would find his own time for solitude to be by himself in prayer, whether it was the liturgy in the early hours of the day, which he did very, very strictly, something for us to learn from. And we all have that capacity. We all can wake up instead of waking up at 5 a.m. to go to the gym, we can wake up 5 a.m. to pray. We can all steal time like that instead of spending, Netflix and we're watching into the middle of the night. Why not stop at 10 o'clock and spend, half an hour in solitude, in silence before the presence of God? So we all have the same capacity to do that. Then regardless of how busy our lives are, regardless of how busy our families are, there's time to do that.
Next question is Kyrillos Tedros. Hi, Abuna.
Yes.
Thank you so much for such a great scholarly work on Saint Kyrillos VI. I had a question regarding that. There are claims that the teachings of Saint Isaac of Nineveh had extreme Nestorian influence. Can you expand on that? If so, thank you, Abuna.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about those claims. They're often not scholarly claims. So I don't think, as far as I know, most mainstream Orthodox scholars from both Eastern and Oriental Orthodox have no issue with actual teaching of St. Isaac the Syrian. There's actually not a great deal of Christological teachings. If you read through St. Isaac the Syrian, you actually find there's not much. He doesn't get much into doctrine. He's more focused on the activity of the spiritual life, things on ideas of tears, on prayer, on vigil, on humility, on forgiveness, on experiencing the Shekhinah, the presence of God. That's where his writings are kind of focused. So I don't think that's the case in terms of his actual writings. The problem is that because he came from an area which is now classically where the Assyrian Orthodox Church is, that we accuse them often of being Nestorian. What's really interesting, though, is, are they? When you speak to them, for example, and I remember Father Tadros Malati, who used to serve in New Jersey, actually told me this story himself. He said that he spoke to the Assyrian Archbishop in New York and asked him, "Can you tell me, please, are you guys Nestorian or not?" He said, "Look, I don't know if I can answer that question." He goes, "It all depends on which part of our history you look to. In that area where our church was formed, Iraq, that kind of area, there were periods where the Nestorians took over, and then the Orthodox took over, then the Nestorians took over, then the Orthodox took over. And so it really depends on what part of our history you look at the writings, whether we were Nestorian or not." So, for example, in Australia, the Assyrian Archbishop is one of our students at St. Cyril's, and he's doing his PhD under us. There is nothing in his teaching or his church's teaching that you'd consider to be heretical. So I guess I'm not trying to be to side skirt and say there are no issues there. That's not my decision. I'm not involved in any of those consultations, thanks be to God. And we leave that to the church to decide. But I can guarantee you, in terms of the teaching of St. Isaac the Syrian, it's entirely Orthodox, and has been absorbed as entirely Orthodox, as probably one of the greatest Orthodox spiritual writers for both Eastern and Oriental Orthodox heritage, which is shown very clearly in the lives of people like Pope Kyrillos, the lives of Pope Shenouda, the lives of Buddha Meskin, where he was the key influencer there. So certainly, again, and also it's a little bit, what's the word for it? Anachronistic to kind of try to put that Nestorian kind of label onto him, especially since they didn't bear those labels themselves. And then there's a lot of talk in actual history about ethics, whether that particular diocese was Nestorian at that time is another historical question. But either way, it doesn't play out in his writings. So they're totally safe. You can actually get them. They're Ascetical Homilies, the big green volume. I think they're still selling them on Amazon. Part 2 has been recently published, and Part 3 is published in fragments, I think. But stick with, the green volume is quite beautiful.
Okay. Abuna, I don't see any more pending questions.
Thanks be to God.
I mean, everyone's home. Everyone's just foggy right now. So I would love for you to speak to us a little about St. Cyril Theological College.
Sure.
Because we do hear a lot about it, but it would be great to hear it from you directly. And just as a reminder, Abuna is the Dean of St. Cyril Theological College. And we hear wonderful things about it. But again, we want to hear it from you direct.
Yeah, so St. Cyril's is based in Sydney, Australia. It was formed in 1982, and then as Pope Shenouda Theological Seminary. And then I think it was rebranded, renamed, just as we went in a different direction, in 2000 and something, 2015 or something, or 2014. And so it's been functioning for quite a long time. We have it's basically a theological seminary, is what you'd call it, a theological school. It's actually called a theological college because in Australia, you're considered to be a college of a university. And so it's part of the Sydney College of Divinity, which is the university that we're under. So thanks be to God, it's got a very strong faculty. We've been blessed with many people in Sydney who are came to us at the right time. And so it's been quite beautiful watching the growth of the theological school. We have something like 120 students studying with us at the moment from all over the world, Sydney, as well as other states of Australia, as well as in Europe, America and Canada. And so we are set up as a face-to-face as well as online theological college. And so every unit we offer can either be taken as face-to-face, can be taken as live streaming, and so you can log in by video conferencing similar to this, or can be just watched online as a distance kind of online student. And so we're experiencing social distancing as well right now, but thanks be to God, that was quite easy to transition for us. We just told the students stay home and watch as if you were an online student. So it's been quite beautiful. We offer everything from an undergraduate diploma, Bachelor of Theology, all the way up to a Master's of Theological Studies, Master of Arts, MDiv, as well as a PhD in theology. And so, so you can check us out on stcyrils.edu.au. We're currently in the middle of semester 1, which I think it's probably a little bit late to enroll in, but I think you can if you really wanted to. You'd just be 4 or 5 weeks late. And you can see what degree, what subjects we offer. So they're probably the two strengths there. We do a lot of patristics and we do a lot of biblical studies. So biblical studies is one of the things that is quite weak throughout the world, not in Coptic Orthodox theological schools. I mean, like literally everywhere, Protestant, Catholic, everywhere. Orthodox biblical studies is quite weak. And so we're trying to kind of bridge that gap and meet that niche of really giving authentic Orthodox biblical studies.
Question: do they offer? I think Menardo's. Yeah. Do they offer online degrees and classes for those across the world? The person asking this question, his name is actually Menardos. Just so you know.
Okay, no, it's lovely. So all of our units are offered online, as well as all of our degrees. So you can do an entire degree anywhere in the world. Our online technology is really, really good. A lot of the resources we have, they're all online. So, yeah, thanks be to God. Thanks be to God.
Okay. Abuna, I had posted, and this is now for everyone that's also viewing on YouTube Live and on Facebook, that the book is available right now at St. Vladimir's website, svspress.com. And there's a promotion right now with the promotion code of Stay Home at 40% off. So it's a great opportunity for you guys to purchase the book at this time. Abuna, we would love to have you in New York. And
I'd love to come.
It was a great blessing when you were here the last time, and it was very short duration. It was for a conference that was for all the the lands of immigration, I believe, if I recall. And it was a great blessing, and that was really the most opportune time for us to see each other. But how flexible are you in travel? Forget Corona right now. I mean, in the future, how flexible are you at traveling for? I'm asking now on behalf of like the whole world, on behalf of for conventions, retreats, any sort of events that young professionals, graduates, college students would benefit greatly from you. How likely, how flexible, and someone's messaging me ECCYC, which is an Emba Musa retreat from way over 30 years ago that's still going today.
Yeah, look, I mean, I'm more than happy to do anything. I was supposed to be traveling with my wife in the middle of the year, and so that's we're very upset that we're not going to be traveling, and so we've got to reschedule that. But I mean, yeah, anything is possible. Anything is possible.
Okay, great. Abuna, thank you so much for joining us, and I pray for you and the family, your congregation, everyone that is affected right now by COVID-19, by the coronavirus. And it's really a time of growth, I believe, for us individually, as families, as communities, at this time of this pandemic, because it is a time for us to really have a more introspective look on our lives and where we are in our relation with God and relation with each other. I ask you to pray for us, and I ask you also to close in prayer for us before we end this call.
No worries. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. We thank you, O Lord, for your care. We thank you, O Lord, for bringing us together in this, remarkable online technology. We thank you, O Lord, for giving us a chance to reflect upon you. We thank you, O Lord, for a chance to reflect upon the life of Pope Kyrillos. We beg him for his intercession, that his life is not a historical life, but it's a life that gives us meaning, a life that gives us direction today as we try to deal with these different struggles. We ask you, Lord, that you have mercy on us, that you bless us, that you protect us, that you give us a chance of repentance, you give us a chance to see your light again. You give all those who are in this particular group a chance, O Lord, to see you, to know you, and to encounter you. We ask you, Lord, through the prayers and intercessions of all the holy saints this day, through the blessings of this holy fast, through the blessings of Pope Kyrillos and Isaac the Syrian, our Mother and Queen Saint Mary, that we dare to cry to our Father, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven,
hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not to temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. In Christ Jesus our Lord, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen.
Thank you very much, Father.
Thank you, Abuna, so much. Your prayers. If anyone's interested, this is on YouTube, on our church's YouTube account, this lecture, this talk. It's on St. Mary and St. Mark channel on YouTube, as well as on the Facebook page for our church, St. Mary and St. Mark, Manhattan, New York. And you could also follow us on YouTube, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Twitter, at SMSMNYC. That will make it easy for you. Abuna, thank you so much, and thank you for just staying on forever. I know I told you 45
I'm sorry.
minutes.
I bored you forever.
No, it was beautiful. It was beautiful. It was so beautiful. Thank you, Abuna, so much. And we will keep in touch.
My blessing, Abuna. Thank you so much.
Pray for us always, Abuna.
I need your prayers. Thank you.
Good night.